Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast. This is episode 57, The Life and Loves of Theudebert I. You are all sharp people, evidenced by your continuing listenership of the podcast. So I am confident that you are all sharp enough to have already guessed the main subject of this episode, which will be Theudebert I, the son of Theuderic, and therefore the eldest grandchild of Clovis. He will be the bulk of the episode, and we will talk about his life both before and after he came to power, the growing reach of Francia generally, and Theudebert specifically, and a bit about his relationship with Justinian, with whom he was contemporary. First, though, we need to finish off his father. When we left off last time, we'd whittled down the number of Frankish kings to 3. Well, a Burgundian axe had, if we want to be accurate. Just to review, those kings were Theuderic, Hilderic, and Clothar. Clothar, the youngest, has so far shown himself to be the most unsparing in his viciousness, having stabbed his 2 young nephews to death with his own hand. Hildebert seems to have had the loudest conscience of the 3 of them, as we saw him attempt to protect one of his nephews from Clothar. Can't really place him in the saint category, though, since his protection ended as soon as his own life was threatened, and the whole thing was apparently his idea to begin with. The eldest, Theuderic, was half-brother to the 2 of them, and has shown himself to be just as aggressive and unstable and maybe just a little bit dim. Each of these brothers ruled a segment of the unitary entity known as Francia. The terms for these sub-kingdoms that you'll see sometimes is Teilreich. It is not a term that any of these kings or their subjects would have recognized at the time, and is not one I'm likely to use much either, but I thought I should mention it for the sake of completeness and interest. The story continues today with Theuderic and especially his son, Theudebert, who is widely considered one of the strongest of the Merovingian kings. Father Theuderic's Teilreich was, broadly speaking, concentrated in the northeastern part of Francia, and across the Rhine with dominion over the Thuringians. It is a region that will soon enough be known as Austrasia. When we saw him last, he was walking away from the body of the last king of the Thuringians, with his hands in his pockets, whistling casually. Oh, the poor fellow seems to have fallen from the town wall. He must have slipped. How awful. In between all the warring and not throwing people off of town walls, Theuderic found time to set his son up with an advantageous betrothal. The lucky lady was the daughter of a king of the Langobards, a people we have managed to avoid talking up until now. The digression thus makes itself known. The Langobards, later to be known as the Lombards, are going to become important to us in the not-too-distant future. According to their own legends, the Langobards were part of that complex of Germanic tribes that originated in the north and moved southward, driven by overpopulation. They originally called themselves the Winili, and were led by a woman named Gambara and her sons. In their migration, the Winili came into contact with the Vandals, who offered them a choice: cake or death. No. The choice was to pay tribute or face death, so I guess it is cake or death in a way. The Winili refused to give in to extortion and prepared to fight. They were greatly outnumbered, and so they sought the help of their gods, as you do. The father god, Godin, said he would give victory to whomever he saw first in the morning of the battle, so Gambara sought the help of the goddess Freya, who turned Godin's bed to face the Winili's camp. When he saw them, the god asked, "Who are these long beards?" and gave them both victory and a new name, Langobardi, the Longbeards. It's a fun story, but disbelieved by its source, the very Christian Paul the Deacon, who thought the beard part made sense, but not so much the gods. These gods, by the way, are an iteration of the familiar Odin/Wotan and Freya from Norse and broader Germanic myth. Modern linguists and historians suggest that the tribe's name actually derives from Langbarda, an epithet for Odin, though still meaning the long-bearded. Thus, it is an example of the familiar practice of tying the tribe's ancestry to a founding hero and/or god. That's all as may be. By the time Theuderic was matchmaking for his son, the Langobards were living in the north of what is now Czechia, in an uneasy tributary relationship with the neighboring Heruls. Both would have been feeling the pressure from the Gepid kingdom further east, and connections to a powerful king of the Franks was very desirable. The Langobard princess was named Visigard, daughter of Wacho. Gregory of Tours, who is our source for all of this, does not record how Theudebert felt about the betrothal, but arranged marriages being the norm, he probably didn't think very much about it at all at the time. Besides, he had plenty to keep him busy. Young Theudebert had already proved his military credentials by defeating an army of Danes that had come raiding into his father's northern territories. They were led by a king named Chlochelach, who is identified by 19th century historian N.F.S. Grundtvig as the historical basis for King Hygelac from Beowulf. I'm fairly certain that I've talked about this before, but repetition is how you learn. The Danish king was killed in the battle, and thanks to his enormous size, his body was preserved and displayed in the Frankish king's hall as part of his treasure. Being a pagan, Chlochelach was not entitled to proper funeral rites as far as the Franks were concerned. That battle was in 516, and Theudebert would have been about 16 years old at the time. His father had another job for him. Since the death of Clovis, the Visigoths had been sneakily reoccupying their old territories in Aquitaine. Given the relatively light settlement of Franks in the south, this probably entailed very little violence, just a Visigothic leader showing up at a town's gate with an entourage and announcing, "Hey, we're back." Obviously, that couldn't be allowed to continue. Theuderic sent Theudebert to do something about it. He teamed up with his cousin, Clothar's oldest son, and headed south to drive out the trespassers. The cousin reached Rodez and turned back for reasons unknown. Theudebert carried on toward Béziers, in Septimania, and captured one of its outlying fortresses, at a place called Dioevecchia. The fortress was sacked, and Theudebert sent a warning ahead of him to the nearby town of Cabrieres, threatening to burn the place to the ground if it did not surrender. Now, there was a woman living in Cabrieres named Deuteria. Deuteria was from a wealthy and well-connected Gallo-Roman family, one which not so long ago would have been of senatorial rank, and she was related to our old friend Sidonius Apollinaris. Deuteria was apparently the authority in Cabrieres, her husband having gone to Béziers to assist in its defense. Deuteria did not care for the idea of her town being burned down around her ears, and so surrendered to Theudebert. When they met, there was a meeting of minds, as well as other parts of the anatomy. Deuteria's husband and the Langobard princess were forgotten. In this story, we are at the mercy of Gregory's episcopal censoriousness, so it's hard to know what exactly the situation was, but it seems that the two genuinely had an emotional connection as well as a physical one. This wasn't just a spoils of war situation like we saw with Clothar and Radegund in the last episode. What this all meant for Theudebert's campaign is unclear. Gregory does not mention Béziers falling to sack, but he also does not indicate that Theudebert withdrew from Septimania. Maybe he was simply enjoying Cupid's Grove in Cabrieres while his men kicked their heels, and presumably made themselves obnoxious to the locals. Meanwhile, Papa Theuderic was carrying on according to his idiom. The man he had left in charge at Clermont-Ferrand was making the locals unhappy. His name was Sigivald, and he was overtaxing them, confiscating property, and generally making himself a nuisance. Theuderic took care of the situation directly. There was no personal improvement plan put in place, no meeting with management and HR to align values or close the loop on objectives. There was simply the drawing and utilization of Theuderic's sword. He was a hands-on kind of manager. Actually, whether Theuderic executed Sigivald from his governments of Clermont is moot. He was certainly executed. That part isn't in doubt, but Sigivald was a relative of the dynasty, and it may have been for dynastic, or just personal, reasons that Theuderic had him killed. He also knew how blood feuds worked, and knew that Sigivald's son, also named Sigivald, would be honor-bound to avenge his father. He also knew that the younger Sigivald was down south with Theudebert's army. Convenient, thought Theuderic, and he sent a note down to his son asking him to please trim that loose thread. Thank you so much. Theudebert roused himself from whatever he was doing to read his father's letter. He then sent for Sigivald the younger. When the young man arrived, Theudebert passed him the letter. I imagine that Sigivald paled, and for a moment wondered what Theudebert's intentions were in sending for him. He needn't have worried. Theudebert advised him to make himself scarce. When my father dies and you learn that I am reigning in his place, you can return to me safe and sound." Sigvald did not need to be told twice. He rode to Gothic-occupied Arles, but then decided it was still too close to Theuderic to be safe and made his way to Italy to hide there. Shortly afterward, Theudebert received news that his father had fallen ill, and things weren't looking good. Theudebert was not a stupid man, and he knew his uncles, Childebert and Clothar, well enough to know that if he was not Johnny on the spot when his father met his maker, most of his inheritance would find its way up their sleeves before he even got a peek at it. He rode for home, probably either Metz or Reims. He left Deuteria behind with her 2 children, an older daughter by her former husband, and another girl that she had borne Theudebert as a result of their affair. So this had been going on for a while now. Theudebert moved north as quickly as he could, but it wasn't fast enough. Theuderic I died in 534, aged 46 or 47. I described him earlier as possibly a bit dim, without really justifying it. But, if you think back, last time I mentioned that after he defeated the Thuringians, Clothar avoided a ham-fisted assassination attempt by Theuderic. That attempt had involved a man hiding behind a curtain that was too short to conceal his feet. So I can't really bring myself to apologize for the description of him. Theuderic had been a king of the Franks for 23 years, and his position now fell to his much brighter son. Clothar and Childebert were certainly emotionally prepared to move against Theudebert and take at least part of his inheritance from him, but in the words of Gregory of Tours, Theudebert bought them off, with the help of his people established himself on the throne, and violence was avoided. Given our experience with the Franks up until now, the phrase "violence was avoided" seems absolutely wild to me. It may have been that the two were distracted by activities in the south. In the previous year, they had allied for another attack on the Burgundians. This time, when the two armies met near Autun in 532, the victory went to the Franks. There would be no further reprieve for the Burgundian kingdom, and over the 2 years following the battle, it was progressively absorbed into the Frankish kingdom. Godemar, the last king of the Burgundians, disappears from the historical record, and we do not know what ultimately became of him. Theudebert may have gotten a bit of a break at his succession simply because Childebert and Clothar were too busy with that process to have the extra energy to devote to screwing over their nephew. Childeric offered for an even greater rapprochement, and decided to adopt Theudebert as his own heir, since he had no sons. Gifts flowed from uncle to nephew, and Theudebert's loins settled that much more firmly into the seat of power. He passed his uncle's generosity on in the traditional way, including to Sigvald the Younger, who returned from hiding in Italy and received all of his father's lands back. To complete his court, Theudebert sent for Deuteria and her children to join him, now that he felt secure. He married his mistress, her husband having presumably died in the interim, and they had another child, a son, who they named Theudebald. The abandonment of Isengard, Theudebert's official fiancée, was both a domestic and international scandal. We talked earlier about how this kind of marriage, the Friedeleia, was known and fairly common, but not necessarily approved of. The idea of invoking the Frankish royal custom of polygamy seems not to have come up. One wonders whether this was the Langobards who objected to the idea of their princess being a second wife, or the Gallo-Roman Deuteria herself. Probably both. Seems likely. I'm going to jump ahead in the timeline and bring the story of Deuteria to the end. The relationship seems to have been deep and ultimately what we might today call unhealthy. Gregory tells us, in the dispassionate, just reporting the facts mode that he often uses for gossip, that as her eldest daughter grew older, Deuteria worried that she would become a rival for the king's affections, and had her drowned. Yeesh. This kind of thing would do nothing for the public perception of Theudebert's personal predilections, and hostility to the relationship built and built. Now, public, I feel compelled to remind you all, does not mean the majority of the population of Theudebert's lands. He couldn't care less about the opinion of a few 100,000 unarmed peasants. Public opinion in this case meant the opinion of a few hundred householders and bishops who controlled the vast majority of the money, military power, and moral authority in the kingdom. Finally, the king was forced to concede to the pressure. He put Deuteria aside, which is a phrase that seems deliberately calibrated to disguise the emotional brutality of such a thing, and married the amazingly patient Wizigard. How she felt about the delay, or about her very public second banana ship, we will never know. However she felt, Wizigard did not have to endure the feeling very long. She died after only a short time, we don't know exactly how long. She did manage to exert a bit of influence in her time, though, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Theudebert, probably mindful of that public opinion, resisted the temptation to take Deuteria back and married another woman, whom Gregory does not bother to name, and with whom he had no children. Theudebert's home territory included the city of Cologne. Cologne Cathedral includes a tomb, dating to the early 6th century, in which 2 bodies were found, a woman in her 20s and a young boy, along with grave goods. Given that they were interred in a church crypt and not mashed into the mud of Belgium or wherever, the treasure is in remarkably good shape and is truly gorgeous. Some of the items have been identified as Langobardic based on similarities to other finds, and so this is sometimes said to be Wizigard's tomb. There are problems with that identification, as with any tomb of the period that's tied to an individual. There is the mystery of the boy, for instance, who genetic testing revealed to be unrelated to the woman. So what's going on there? Who the heck is he? I mostly just mention it because the artifacts really are beautiful, and you can check them out on Instagram or the website, etc., etc. Outside of his domestic arrangements, Theudebert had to deal with the often tense relationship with his uncles. When Theudebert flipped Childebert to his side, Clothar didn't just go away. Given what you all know about Clothar, that shouldn't be surprising, and the other kings were wary of him. Theudebert and Childebert made preparations for a preemptive strike. Clothar knew they were coming and took up a defensive position in the woods. The other two's armies were large enough to surround the wood, and Clothar looked to be trapped. Things looked dire for the youngest son of Clovis. On the night before battle was set to take place, a violent storm blew in. Their tents were blown down, their equipment was scattered, and everything was overturned. There was thunder and lightning, and they were bombarded with hailstones. They had no protection except their shields, and they were afraid they would be struck by lightning. The horses were scattered far and wide. Some were recovered 2 or 3 miles away. Many never found at all. The 2 kings were cut about by the hailstones as they laid on the ground. They did penance to God and begged him to forgive them for having attacked their own kith and kin. Gregory credits the storm to Clotilde, who, desperate to prevent civil war among her family, prayed fervently to St. Martin to intercede, and Gregory's favorite saint came through. And the Bishop of Tours was always prepared to add a little shine to the saint whose relics were in his keeping. Clothar and Childebert took a brother's holiday to Spain to try and mend fences, as you do. Nothing like beating up Visigoths and taking their stuff to make you forget the time your brother went to war against you. The campaign was at best a middling success. The Franks brought back plenty of pillage, but were driven away from Zaragoza by an appeal to St. Vincent. Gregory reported great pillage, but no territorial gain for the effort. While his personal life was, shall we say, complicated, Theudebert's status was growing both within Francia and the wider European context. And so we will turn to foreign affairs. While the Merovingians fussed with each other over their various territories and harassed the neighbors, opportunities were beginning to appear. Visigothic power had been significantly bolstered by the direct involvement of Theodoric the Great in Hispania, but he died in 526 and was succeeded by his daughter Amalasuentha, as we have discussed in some depth. The spiraling crisis in Italy made the kings of the Franks prick up their ears, since Amalasuentha was kin through her mother. When Theoda had murdered the queen, all 3 Merovingians signed a letter demanding compensation, the queen's weregild, or there would be war. Theoda had enough on his plate without Frankish intervention and agreed to pay 50,000 pieces of gold, which Theudebert and Childebert conspired to keep for themselves, cutting Clothar out of the action. Really, I wonder if there is even a word for trust in Frankish. Clothar wasn't having it, raided and took control of parts of Childebert's lands, far more valuable than his share of the tribute would have been. Theudahad's tribute did not guarantee his safety, of course. Justinian was laying the groundwork for his Italian war, following up the empire's success in Africa. The Franks seemed to be ideal allies. They had a proven military prowess and followed the Orthodox faith, mostly. Justinian sent cash to the Merovingians with promises of more once they'd intervened, and the Franks proved to be united and faithful allies working alongside Belisarius' troops as they battled the forces of the long-hated Arian heresy for the good of the empire. I'm kidding, obviously. If you remember our episodes from the First Gothic War, the Franks first induced the Burgundians to take advantage of the Italian chaos, and later on Theudebert led his own men into northern Italy to pillage the already war-ravaged country in 538 and or 539. Militarily, this mission went well enough. Both the Goths and Byzantines had reason to think Theudebert had come as an ally, but the Franks had come entirely for their own purposes. Theudebert fought both, routed the Goths on the banks of the Po, and drove the Byzantines into Tuscany. It turned out, though, that famine and plague were just as much a problem for the Franks as they were for the locals, and as his men began to die unpleasantly of dysentery around him, Theudebert withdrew. He would send other expeditions into Italy under the leadership of other commanders. Here is an example of Gregory of Tours' information becoming sketchy the further from home his subject goes. Gregory reports that the second expedition conquered the whole of the peninsula all the way down to Sicily. Now we know from Procopius and his successor historians that that is simply not true. At most, the Franks exercised some temporary military authority over the upper Po Valley. It's likely that Gregory was getting this information second or third hand from the descendants of those raiders and commanders, and that some, or a lot, of exaggeration made its way into his account. What is true is that Frankish armies were active in Italy, and making life for the Italians, which was already far from a rose garden, even more miserable. The plunder from both of these expeditions all found its way into Theudebert's treasury, making him ever richer than his uncles, and able to push his influence further and further afield. The Franks' absolute refusal to do anything for any reason other than their own interest was irritating to Justinian. Worse was the continuous push of Theudebert's influence eastward, as he exerted pressure on the Alemanni and the Langobards to dance to his tune. 2 letters survive from Theudebert to Justinian. In one, he lists all the lands and peoples over which he claims dominion. He lists Thuringians, Visigoths, Saxons, and Jutes as all acknowledging his dominion, and of holding sway over territory stretching from the ocean to northern Italy and extending all the way to the frontiers of Pannonia. Now, simply claiming dominion over a people or territory does not make it so. The degree of Theudebert's control over any of these groups is entirely moot, and it's to be expected in a diplomatic communication that the Frankish king will make himself seem as big as important as he possibly can. But even allowing for that, it's an impressive swathe of territory. Theudebert does not mention any lands known to be in the sphere of either of his uncles, so we can guess he's speaking only for himself. He could potentially, if his influence continued to spread eastward, become a threat to the empire's interests. Theudebert's letters, among other things, indicate that he expected to be treated as a king, not a subject. Up until now, the fiction had been maintained that all the kings of the Western kingdoms were still subject rulers. They were governing on the emperor's behalf as kind of viceroys or satraps. True, they took no orders and returned no tax revenue, but the Goths and Franks considered themselves the preservers and continuation of Romanitas, just in a different form. So symbolic standards were still maintained. There was a convention, for example, of minting gold coins with the image and name of the emperor, not of the Western king. Theudebert was the first Frankish king to abandon that convention around 530, circulating gold coinage under his own name and image. In Hispania, that shift wouldn't take place until the 580s, under Leovigild. The expanding power of Theudebert, his evident willingness to flex that power, and his disregard for imperial feelings, led to a rumor reported in Byzantine histories that he was planning to invade the empire itself and take control of Thrace. That never happened, but the fear that it might is meaningful. The Frankish king suddenly had to be taken into account, not just as a tool to be used in Italy or Hispania, but as a potential rival. Theudebert probably had no designs on imperial territory. But even if he never touched imperial soil, for the first time since 476, There was a power competing with the empire for the loyalty and attention of the tribes beyond the Danube. There was potential for the Gepids, Langobards, and other Eastern Germanic people to play politics and pit East against West. The last time such a powerful destabilizing agent had appeared on that frontier, it had been the Huns. So no wonder Justinian and his courtiers were worried. While the empire fretted, the Frankish church celebrated their powerful ruler. Once he was firmly established on the throne, Theudebert proved himself to be a great king, distinguished by every virtue. He ruled his kingdom justly, respected his bishops, was liberal to the churches, relieved the wants of the poor, and distributed many benefits with piety and friendly goodwill. With great generosity he remitted to the churches of Clermont-Ferrand all of the tribute which they used to pay to the royal treasury. I have also already told the story of the king's investment in the city of Verdun and how he refused repayment of that loan. As far as his own bishops were concerned, Theudebert was a king worthy of praise. And yet, in Gregory's telling, there is some equivocation. Book 3 of his Historia, from which just about all of this comes, is an odd piece of writing, as it seesaws back and forth from praise for Theudebert's generosity and his victories, to stories of shady personal activities and noble rivalries at his court. Most obvious is the matter of Theudebert's relationship with Deuteria and his treatment of Visigard. It's as if Gregory is saying that Theudebert did all these good things that I and my fellow churchmen heartily approve of, but also seeding in hints that the reality was not quite as perfect and shining as the official line might suggest. To give an example, there is the case of Asteriolus and Secundinus. These two were in high positions in Theoderic's service, and simply could not get along. Secundinus was a proud man who rubbed his position of favor in the faces of everyone, and it rubbed Asteriolus the wrong way. The two argued constantly, eventually coming to blows. Asteriolus gave the proud Secundinus a good beating, but the fight resolved nothing. Theudebert took sides in the argument, supported Secundinus, and humiliated Asteriolus by making him subordinate to his enemy. Now, we have no real context here. We don't know the actual issues between the two men, or their personalities in any detail, but surely this is a little bit ham-fisted. One of the king's most basic functions was to act as a mediator between the powerful men of his kingdom and keep internal harmony as far as was possible. And here Theudebert seems to be doing the exact opposite. Here is also the only time we see Visigard exercising any influence at court, as through her intervention Asteriolus was returned to the king's favor. But resentment still boiled under the surface. As soon as the queen died, Secundinus made his move and killed his rival. He made the crucial mistake, however, of leaving Asteriolus' son alive, and when he had grown, he made his intentions to take revenge clear. Secundinus was forced to flee, pursued from house to house and town to town, until he finally chose to free himself via poison, rather than fall into the hands of his enemy. This is exactly the kind of blood feud that kings all over the post-Roman world were enacting laws to try and address. Yet Gregory makes no mention of Theudebert making any effective attempt to moderate this dispute or resolve issues. The one thing he did just made everything worse. So there are hints that all was not sweetness and light. Theudebert was not all-knowing or universally benevolent. Gregory is willing to acknowledge the grit in the oyster. There are two stories about how Theudebert met his end. Gregory simply reports that he took ill and died, which is the version I'm inclined toward given Gregory's comparative closeness. The second version comes from Agathias, who is Procopius' continuator. He claims that Theudebert was killed by a bison while hunting, and that sent me off on a digression. Ignorant American that I am, I was under the impression that the European bison, or wisent, was one of those fantastic extinct mammals like the giant sloth or saber-toothed cat, a creature that humans interacted with once, but has been long extinct by the time we got around to writing anything down. Turns out I was very much incorrect in this, and that not only was the European bison around to gore Frankish kings to death, it survives into the modern day, though it was once very dicey for a while. Its range shrank consistently as European forests were cut down, until by the 19th century it survived only in a few pockets in Poland and the northern Caucasus. It has made a comeback, though, beginning in the 1950s through an effort spearheaded by Poland, and there are now herds in several European countries, including Spain and Portugal. Nice. Physically, the European bison is taller than its American cousin, and if you haven't been near one, the American version is already frighteningly tall. Anyway, apologies for digressions into wildlife conservation, but I thought it was interesting. Whether by bison or disease, or both, I suppose, Robert Baratheon style, Theudebert I died in 548, probably approaching but not quite reaching his 50th year. He had been king of his Franks for 14 years. He had made himself a force to be reckoned with, and considered one of the Merovingians' most effective rulers. His son by Deuteria, Theudebald, inherited his crown without a peep of objection or interference from any of his relatives, which is in itself a comment on Theudebert's effectiveness. There was a final sting in the tail, and a reminder that his administration was far from perfect. Theudebert's death removed royal protection from his chief tax collector, who was tracked down by an angry mob in Trier and stoned to death. Gregory has little sympathy for the man, making sure to note, in addition to being a cruel exploiter, he habitually used to break wind in public. Sic transit gloria mundi. We will end there with the death of a gassy taxman. Next time, I want to briefly turn to the question of Gregory and his class. What were these bishops like? Men of God, of course, exercising a moderating influence on the violence of their militaristic kings. Well, sometimes, yes. Sometimes, really, really no. Thank you for listening, and thank you for those of you who support the show through Ko-fi.com. This month I'll be Tom and Alex, and as always, thank you to my monthly contributors Paul, Barchester, Micaiah, Alex, John, Dusty, Jesse, Other Alex, and Eric, and welcome to new monthly contributor Toasty. I will work to keep making it worth your while. If you feel like it, reviews of the show are always appreciated, and I enjoy seeing comments on Spotify as well. Thank you all again for listening. Doing this would make absolutely no sense if you didn't. Until next time, take care.